Senator from Tennessee.
Democrats tried to accelerate the passage of this bill later that same day. Instead of going through the normal multi-day process for debating and enacting a bill, they tried to rush it through in the middle of the night. I objected to accelerating this process on Thursday because the Senate must carefully consider what it's doing. Now the proponents of this bill claim that the CBO's analysis is wrong. No matter how much explaining they do, the Senate agreed on the umpire before the game started. To this end, if this bill is paid for, why will we have to waive Budget Act requirements later on in this process? The Senate is going to have to pass this bill by waiving the Budget Act or the pay-go requirements. That's not paid for. Most of us probably won't be around when the bill comes due for this never-ending deficit spending here in Washington. But sadly, our children and our grandchildren will be. The politicians in Washington spend now to buy votes, but conveniently won't be around to deal with the consequences. We can do hard infrastructure. Again, that's a worthy goal. But we can do it without shoveling more debt on the backs of our children and to our grandchildren. Indeed, if we just limited this bill to hard infrastructure, it would be paid for. As I said, there are good and bad ways to achieve noble ends. The second reason that I'm opposed to this legislation is because of its big government, top-down approach. It includes many half-baked components that deserve far more scrutiny. Rather than compete against China, using our unparalleled innovation, our ingenuity, our technology, we're substituting massive government control to dictate, to fund, and to decide winners and losers. That's not the American way. We're using the cryptocurrency market as a pay-for. Have we fully vetted how this new regulation and taxation will affect this rapidly developing industry? We wind up ceding this industry to others because of this regulation. What's the point of even having committees in the Senate with expertise in certain matters if the most significant legislation that passes this body doesn't even go through them? The whole point of committees is to use them. Use these committees to carefully scrutinize and refine important legislation. Use the committees to prevent unintended consequences that result from rushed legislation. Yet this is a 2,700-page bill that is going through no committees. Once again, we have to pass it to find out what's in it, and then learn what kind of unintended consequences we can expect.
We've seen a startling uptick in inflation across the board, everything from gas to groceries, everything from health care to housing. We see that increasing stunningly in a way that a lot of people are pointing out correctly, that first-time home buyers are now finding it very difficult to get into a home. This is something that's going to end up affecting all poor and middle-class Americans at a time when they can little afford it. And yet we're increasing these fees that are, in effect, a backdoor invisible tax on a lot of those who are at least in a position to pay it. Some of the other non-fake pay-fors that actually do bring something in include an increase in the fees paid by manufacturers and distributors of certain chemicals. The issue there is that this fee, well, labeled as not a tax because technically speaking it's not a tax, will end up increasing the price of basically every consumer good purchased by the American people. The way these things end up working is that, to the tune of about $15 billion or so, Americans will find that pretty much everything they buy, from apparel to electronics, will get a little more expensive. They may not see it. In fact, the overwhelming majority of them won't even know to attribute it to this particular piece of legislation. But it will have that effect. It will make all Americans a little poorer. It'll make all Americans face a very stark reality in which their already strapped dollars that they earn will go just a little bit less far. We have to remember that from one year to the next, we don't see dramatic fluctuations in the quantity of goods that the American people have access to, that they may buy. In other words, the U.S. economy is capable of producing a relatively foreseeable, predictable, somewhat finite supply of goods in a particular year. When that doesn't change dramatically from one year to the next, as it almost never does, but you dramatically increase the money supply in the U.S. economy, then what you see is that everything gets a little bit more expensive. This ends up hurting, in particular, America's poor and middle class. It ends up hurting, in particular, those Americans, including most Americans, who in one way or another live paycheck to paycheck, who in one way or another depend on the income that they have, and the income that they have is relatively fixed. So as a result of that, they don't get as far. Now, you've got some Americans, including the wealthiest and well-connected in our society, who may well figure out ways to get wealthy off of this bill. One way or another, they can play things to their advantage, and they may make a lot of money off of it. You've got another category of very wealthy Americans, maybe, people in the top 1 or 2% of income earners, who might notice that the things they buy are getting more expensive, but it might not affect them all that much. But then you've got everyone else, and I mean the vast, overwhelming majority of all Americans, who, in one way or another, plan out each year knowing that they've got a relatively finite amount of money to spend. And that money goes less far when we just print money to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. Remember, the federal government in recent years has been spending about $4 trillion a year. Tragically, even at the top of our economic cycle, with record low unemployment and with record high growth, we were still spending $1 trillion a year more than we were bringing in. Bringing in about 3, spending about 4. This was inexcusable then. It would be inexcusable now, except that we're making it much, much worse. Last year, we took in about $3 trillion, and we spent $3.6 trillion. Borrowing and then printing close to $4 trillion additional dollars. What does this do? Well, it makes all Americans just a little bit poorer, especially those living on a relatively fixed income. So this is troubling when we do that. We ought to be concerned when we do that. Inflation numbers that are coming out all the time, including some that I've heard about the first time today, indicate that everything's getting more expensive. And what are we doing? Well, we're on track to spend another $1.2 trillion, including $550 billion of new spending, which the bill's proponents claim is paid for when most of it isn't paid for. And that portion of it that is paid for is, in one way or another, often paid for in a way that will inure to the detriment of poor middle-class Americans. This is concerning. It's also concerning that one of the other pay-for provisions, the one focused on cryptocurrency, focuses on an industry that's rapidly developing within the United States, that depends on a lot of innovation happening in the United States. One of these pay-for provisions seeks to bring in more revenue to the federal government, or at least to promise more revenue to the federal government, with the promise of requiring those who buy and sell cryptocurrency to treat it the same way as they would the exchange of securities. Mr. President, this is very different than securities. These aren't just stocks. It's something very different. It's a medium of exchange that, if adopted more widely, could facilitate a lot of economic activity and a lot of innovation within the United States of America. If, in fact, we pass this bill, mark my words, it's going to have a chilling effect on innovation within this sector. And what you'll see is the flight of innovation and investment related to innovation to offshore locations around the globe. Places outside the United States may well be the ones to reap the benefit associated with the loss here in the United States if we adopt an unproven, untested, unknown strategy for dealing with something, trying to adopt many decades-old regulatory policies to a completely new form of exchange. One that, by the way, values very highly the privacy of those who exchange in it. And so if what you're going to do is take away that value by requiring that all of it be registered and publicly disclosed, and by giving the federal government the ability to peer into it, you're going to stifle innovation. You're going to make a lot of people upset, and you're going to make Americans poorer. At the heart of a lot of this is a concern that the federal government, as it takes more and more money, as it prints more and more money, as it requires Americans to work weeks or months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes, only to be told that it's not nearly enough and hasn't been enough for many decades, because we're nearly $30 trillion in debt. That it's still not enough, because we're still going to borrow and print more. It's insulting to them, and it's especially insulting to them when you tell them that in connection with the same legislation that also includes other intrusions into their privacy.